So we spend a lot of time doing, this Labs, we spend a lot of time doing things for the community. So I did bring some, we call them Fempire stickers. I put them outside by the food, but make sure to grab one. Every time I see another woman in the community, I try to make a sticker that looks like her. So there's diversity. And I brought stickers to this conference last week, and this girl came up to me and I said, "Oh, I have a sticker that looks like you." And her hair was blue, half shaved, same hair, but then she was wearing a pink shirt just like this sticker. So it was like the sticker was custom made for her. It was really funny. Anyways, so take one for your team, take one for the ladies on your team, or for your kids, or for the wife, or the girlfriend, or whatever. Okay, today we are going to talk about inclusive architectures and building teams in terms of this thing we like to call the PAMstack and Angular. So for those of you who don't know, PAMstack is a framework for building sustainable development teams. A lot of people use it. I sometimes like to call it the new Agile as a joke. And some people, also larger organizations, like to consider it to be used for change management. And Katerina, who is sitting right over there, she actually, we were supposed to give this keynote at NGDE, but I was left, stranded, who knows where, for like 2 days in the airport. So Katerina gave this at NGDE, so I get to give it today. So PAMstack, this idea of the PAMstack, it's not the Jamstack, but it stands for Process, Abstractions, or in this case, Angular and Mentorship, right? So we're going to explore these three pillars as we talk. But what I want to try to help you all understand, this whole inclusive framework idea, is building a really good foundation for your teams. So you want to make sure, wherever you are within the organization, you want to enable your team. If you can enable your team, this means that your teams have less project maintenance because you don't have a code base that only senior developers can work on, less stress because you have process and agreed upon standards to work from. You also have more cooperative teams, right? Again, we talk about code standards and conventions, using something like Angular to help with things like conflict resolution and more buy-in. It also lowers the cost over time of developers. Again, when you have a more approachable code base, you don't just have to spend money on those senior developers, right? Also, more inclusion. If you can have a team that enables junior developers to be joining, then this allows for a more diverse set of candidates within your organizations. So, Katerina again, I didn't want to torture you and bring you up here as well, but Katerina's awesome. She's one of the this.labs/this.media folks. And my name is Tracy again. I am the CEO of this.labs. We are a framework agnostic consultancy. We love everybody exactly the same, but I might have just a little bit more love for Angular since I feel like it's my family. I'm also on the RxJS core team. If you want to get involved, we're always looking for new people to get excited and involved, and I have some core team members here today with me. Jan Nicholas is somewhere in the crowd. I'm also a Google developer expert for Angular and the web, a Microsoft MVP. Love that Microsoft is here supporting the community, and I also do community relations for Node. So anything JavaScript you want to talk about, I'm always happy to chat. We're also hiring. So let's just talk about the idea of junior developers, right? We all care about inclusivity and helping people in tech, helping underrepresented minorities in tech. But a lot of times we say, okay, juniors are for some reason not successful on teams, and we wonder why. And a lot of times it's not for their lack of knowledge, right? A lot of people say, oh, juniors, they're not good enough for our team yet. But maybe it's not the juniors, maybe it's actually the fault of the teams. If you don't make inclusive decisions within your code base, you don't make good decisions about how to actually structure the team, right, then that might actually be the reason why the juniors are failing. But these decisions, these non-inclusive decisions, actually affect everybody, not just the juniors. So here's some great examples of why juniors fail on teams. If you have poor onboarding documentation, for example, then they always have to ask for everything. There's nothing they can reference on their own. They're just waiting for another person. Individual excellence. When we promote just the rock star developers, then all of a sudden, and you don't rely on mentorship or anything like that, then all of a sudden seniors have to micromanage those juniors all the time to make sure they don't make mistakes. And if they make mistakes, then all of a sudden these directly affect the users, right? Which is really terrible. Also, if you have an unnecessarily complex code base, then all of a sudden, development and design problems that don't actually need to be complex take months and months and months to understand. I was talking to a CTO of I think of the top 10 websites. He's CTO of one of the top 10 websites. He said that it takes a year for a developer to feel productive within their code base. Maybe some of you feel the same thing, but they're obviously not using Angular. And also when you have teams where everybody just assumes, hey, everyone's good, everyone's a senior, they all got it, right? Then there's no learning within the team. There's not a culture of learning and facilitation, and then also teams and individuals just become stagnant. So here's how it actually hurts everybody. If you have poor onboarding documentation, that means anybody that's onboarded either just needs to be good enough, and even then, they're going to have different experiences. So you have inconsistency as you're building your teams. You also spend so much more time explaining the same thing to the same person, and it depends on your mood or the person, different people onboarding different people. Individual excellence as well. So I don't know if you all have heard hit by a bus, but the question is always, if that person gets hit by a bus, then what happens to our team, right? When you have this and you lose somebody, you could spend months or even years refactoring or trying to figure out how to reverse engineer something. Complex code bases, if, again, your code base deviates from industry standards, then it just takes so long for anybody to get productive. And also lack of advancement. We talk about mentorship with the idea of junior developers a lot, mid-level developers. But as a senior level developer, what are you doing? Where are you finding that mentorship or anything, right? Like how does your organization help you become an architect, for example, right? So if you had an inclusive vision, then all of a sudden everybody on your team succeeds. There's more teamwork, there's more collaboration, there's processes in place, there's mentorship. You have no more complex code bases, hopefully. You can focus on things like important features instead of, having to deal with everything else, right? You can focus on building the fun things, which means then all of a sudden you have more innovation and more excitement and, less stress, right, which is awesome. And also, you have a wider, more diverse set of engineers. And this is really amazing because, again, we're always trying to help change the ratio in tech. So let's get back to the PAMstack, this idea. And I just want to talk about P first, which is process. So process for, us developers is not the most amazing thing. I don't love sitting in meetings, but, I do sit in a lot of meetings right now. But it doesn't have to be that. It doesn't have to be all this paperwork, endless meetings, fancy buzzwords. But I just want to read through a description of an organization with no process, and then you tell me if this sounds very familiar to you. So processes, in this organization, processes are usually ad hoc and chaotic. They do not provide a stable environment to support processes, and success depends on the competence and heroics of the people in the organization and not on the proven processes. These organizations are characterized by the tendency to overcommit, abandon their processes in a time of crisis, and be unable to repeat their successes. A lack of process means that only rock star developers can actually succeed. Your team is constantly overcommitted and feeling rushed about everything. You never know why a project failed or succeeded. It's completely arbitrary. Projects always go over schedule, blow over budget. Nobody knows who's supposed to do anything. And there's just so much micromanagement and bike shedding. So this quote is actually from CMMI, which is the Capability Maturity Model Integration for Development. It's a process framework. You can look at it. There's a very 70-page PDF you can read through on it if you like. But the whole idea, again, is that this is what an organization looks like with a lack of process. But if you do process right, you actually think about, hey, okay, I am going to do process. Then all of a sudden your team has clear expectations. There's expanded team engagement and cooperation. There's no single points of failure, that whole idea of being hit by a bus. Less stress during the crazy times. There's no more conflict and power struggles that happen. So let's talk about super easy ways you can just integrate process. So one great thing to do is just create plans. As you're going through the different processes within your team, you just create plans. Ask who needs to do things, what needs to be done, how should it be done, when should it be done, and then write them down and follow them. A great example for this would be like, for example, for a code review, right? So this is an example of how to build a better process for a code review. Write the purpose down, walk through the process, and then discuss things. So this code review will also tell you, hey, when the code reviewer and the person who submitted the PR have a disagreement, who gets, who wins, right? You don't have to wonder anymore. You don't have to see, oh, which manager do I need to talk to? Do I need to convince the 10 people on my team to make this successful, right? It's in the process. No more arguing. It's amazing. So that's one thing. Another thing is this idea of roles and responsibilities. So this is very often overlooked, and I see this a lot. We have a lot of technical leads on our team, and a lot of times it's like, wait, okay, there's 2 architects, but who's doing what? Right? You have to make sure you have very well-defined roles and responsibilities within different projects. So this one is just for the code review that I just showed you, right? And you list out who participates, what is the responsibilities, so everybody knows what is supposed to happen. And again, there's no more like conflict, power struggle type thing going on. Another really easy thing to do, and this really helps with onboarding as well, is create checklists. So as you're going through something, right, like we're all humans, we all make mistakes, and especially let's say during during a launch, right, you have to remember 10 million different things. But instead of doing that, why not just write everything down onto a checklist so you don't have to think about it? You can use this as a guide for later on. And also, if you're the project lead and you're sick, guess what? It's going to be okay. Nobody's going to call you because they have a checklist. Wouldn't that be amazing? So highly, highly recommend creating checklists. Also, make sure as you're doing things like this, make sure you're reviewing things, right? Like a lot of times, we're a consultancy, so we'll review meeting notes, designs, even requirements. Like, is one person on the team telling the customer something else? Are you completely aligned? Did the project managers say that they were going to deliver this yesterday, and the team thinks that they have 4 weeks to complete it, and then everything explodes? Who knows? But making sure you're constantly reviewing everything is really important. So let's talk about the next pillar, which is abstractions. And this time I'll be talking about it more within Angular. So abstractions, these are the things that make writing software more accessible, right? It's tools, abstractions, approaches that enable your team to achieve greater happiness and productivity and inclusivity. So I think the first thing we should acknowledge is that web development is hard. I almost said web accessibility because we're having to do so much accessibility stuff. And I'm like, man, I'm not an accessibility expert. I feel like I have to learn things literally all over again, But this is the problem with our development industry, right? Like, who is an expert in performance? You need to be an expert in performance, accessibility, responsive design, progressive web apps. Oh my God, this is why we have something called JavaScript fatigue, because we're the role as a senior engineer, even as a junior developer, right? Like, are you going to hire a junior developer now if they don't know accessibility? I don't know, but that's hard. That's really hard, So this is why frameworks are so awesome, because while it might be easier to do things like just, raw DOM manipulation, you can actually just use a framework and make it a lot easier. So a great example is, I know Katarina told a story about when she was in university, she had to start a project. And if you think about it as a developer who doesn't know much, if you start a project and you don't know what to do or how to do it or where to get started, you can just spin up an Angular app with a CLI, and it just gives it for you. This was my same experience when I first started development. Somebody gave me Ember CLI, which is what Angular CLI is based on, and all of a sudden I could do everything. I felt like I could take over the world. So that is really amazing. And Angular is very opinionated, but we have to ask ourselves, hey, is that such a bad thing? So if you look at this within the context of a developer, again, joining a large organization, what do? You have multiple pieces running around. Different things are connected everywhere. But, the great part is if the code bases are built in Angular, then all of a sudden, there's much more conventions around it. You can get in and you can, I love to say, hey, if it's written in Angular, I can get productive and submit a PR on the first day, right? So this is one of the reasons why I love Angular. If we just look at Angular in general, again, if you look at it, the reason why Angular is such a powerful abstraction within our industry is the CLI, of course. Angular Console, if you haven't checked out, it's a graphical user interface for the CLI. Also, we have so many amazing external tools like NX, Prettier, great documentation. Even the architecture and the code base can help out in that way. Because there's a component-based architecture, there's much more ability for code reusability. Also, libraries like NGRX and RxJS, of course, that help with state management. Also, TypeScript, which basically saves you from yourself. And Angular Material, which helps you make beautiful sites. And again, even if you know that maybe Angular is the right choice, using something like the CLI, if you've seen the world, I mean, there's a CLI for everything these days, right? That's why it's so awesome. Because, again, you can say you're going to use a technology, but the CLI just does it for you, and that's what I love about it. And I think this is something that we take for granted, so I just like to say it. Angular CLI, we get everything just out of the box. Smart defaults, that zero config environment, out of the box performance that we, again, just take for granted, don't even think about, right? Like lazy loading, tree shaking, ahead of time compilation. The great part is this is actively maintained by the Angular core team as well. It allows for easy migrations between the major libraries. You can always eject. And of course, I talked about Angular Console, which makes life even easier for you. But let's also talk about the architecture of Angular applications. So Minko Getchev, who writes just amazing blog posts and is on the Angular team right now, he wrote this blog post called Scalable Single-Page Application Architecture. And it talks about how to break up an application into layers. So you have the presentation layer, for example, which is concerned with the user interface and how the user interface will actually be drawn and how the user interaction will be handled. Then you have the data management layer, which is concerned with state and data that drives the application. And how user actions change that state. And then you have the services layer, right, which is concerned with how application communications communicates externally with the help of other servers or with direct connections to other users. And finally, the facade layer, which is a layer of abstraction for the data management and services layer for use in the presentation layer. So the reason why the architecture of Angular is so amazing is because junior developers can now just use these abstractions to basically, well, architects as well can just use it to obscure kind of like what happens behind the scenes. And they can focus on things that they can actually do, that they can actually comprehend without breaking the logic. So we talk about components, right? And another great thing about Angular is this idea that you can just build component libraries for Angular really easily, right? You can create components that are reused across different projects and applications. And DOM, or presentation components, or components who don't have any logic, for example, make it a really good place for juniors to start, right? And that's in the presentation layer that we talked about. Also with components, you get easier app-wide style manipulation, which is awesome. You can have more consistent styles across applications. You have better ways to manage CSS. And you can take these and you can create smaller, more easier chunks of things for people to actually do while you're onboarding them, for example, so that they can kind of understand the scale of what they're getting into and actually have their contributions actually matter. So it's very fulfilling. TypeScript as well. I mean, who doesn't love TypeScript? Anybody? You probably wouldn't raise your hand anyways. But I love TypeScript because you're basically forced to have strongly typed methods, variables, and services, and it makes it so much easier to understand the functionality of an actual application and the purpose of each part of the code, right? And because it has stricter rules, that means it comes with less bugs. Like, for example, when we refactored all of our XJS into TypeScript, you'd be surprised how many bugs were actually in the code that, weren't even propagating and affecting anybody, right? So that's amazing. Also, you don't have to try to constantly figure out what method is going to return what the method is going to return or how to treat each new thing, because TypeScript will just tell you how to do it. Also better error handling, which is awesome. And I love the fact that the console also has more descriptive errors to figure out what is wrong. And again, this helps junior developers because if you have a strongly typed language, they'll be so much more careful when they are trying to design new things for the future, and it helps them with best practices. Also, Angular Material, right? I mean, I love Angular Material. When Angular Material was in alpha and the team was saying, oh my gosh, please don't use that in production, I just couldn't help myself. Like, I needed to use Angular Material because I loved it so much. Now it's amazing. It was very broken before. Well, that was an alpha, obviously. But you know, the thing I love about Angular Material is you just get animations out of the box, complex functionalities. There's so many code samples within the documentation that make it very easy for you, and of course, easy global theming. In addition to that, you know, within Angular, there's so many different tools out there. Prettier, which is a VS Code plugin, is so awesome. The one reason why I really like Prettier is because, you know, like, imagine joining a team and just being handed a Prettier file. All of a sudden, you're not having to say, like, am I going to use tabs or spaces? Am I going to do spaces between the brackets, et cetera, et cetera? Everything is just, you know, done for you. No more bike shedding. No more developers coming in and saying, well, I think it should be done this way, right? It also helps junior developers understand the style of your current application. So another tool is NX, which is a really awesome set of dev tools for monorepo development. I'm sure all of you have heard of it. But the code sharing between the front end and the back end and the reduction of code and complexity is really amazing. So great that we have that from Narwhal in our community. Also the great documentation. I mean, I tried Svelte the other day. But every time I clicked on something and really actually tried to use the documents, I would go to a page and they said, sorry, I haven't had time to write this part of the documentation yet. I'm like, how am I going to use Svelte right now? So great thing is that Angular actually has, you know, a really great docs team. Also the Angular community, it's one of the most supportive communities. Again, I say that I love all communities equally, but, you know, when I'm doing something and I need to be productive, and especially when I was first starting, I could just tweet out like, hey, I'm having this problem, and then somebody would come help me from the Angular community, which is so powerful. So the ecosystem is so amazing, whether it's online or offline as well. So we talked about two different pillars, process and abstractions, but I think one of the most important ones also is this idea of mentorship. Right? And one of the reasons why this is so important is because this begins with a culture shift from within your organization. I was thinking about the other day, we have a lot of senior developers at this dot, and you know, they're amazing, and they have different people that they're assigned to from a mentorship perspective, but they're not assigned mentors as well. So what I did is at this dot, we have a lot of different mentors externally that work with our projects as well. And I started assigning the senior developers external mentors so that they could be more productive, so that they could have the mentorship that they needed within their careers. So when we think about this idea of mentorship, so if you think about a team, imagine a team where you could not be promoted if you didn't have somebody to take your job. All of a sudden, you're not trying to, you know, write 10 times the amount of code as anybody else, right? But then all of a sudden, you have to help somebody else to take your job before you can actually move on and get promoted, right? Then all of a sudden, everybody is helping each other versus trying to help themselves, which I think is really amazing. So why is this important? Obviously, hiring is very expensive, right? You want to make sure you keep your people. In addition to that, the value from the mentee and the mentor perspective is so valuable. So with mentees, it accelerates their learning and growth, increases their confidence, it decreases their fear of contribution or collaboration and idea sharing, right? I remember when I first joined the RxJS core team, you know, I was afraid to speak up in the meetings. But what I would do is, after the meetings, I would say, hey, Ben, I wanted to say this thing, but I didn't know if I could or I should. And because he, you know, said yes a few times, now in the core team meetings, I don't even care. I will just say things. If I sound dumb, who cares? But that's the great part, right? Like, you help junior developers or mentees in general be able to say what they want to say and let them know it's okay, and then they'll start communicating more. Also, it increases communication skills, right? The better you can talk through your code, the better developer you become. It also provides upward mobility. So Sun Microsystems found that mentees are actually 5 times more likely to be promoted. And then mentees become mentors for other people. And then all of a sudden, again, it's this culture that you create. Also for everybody else. So obviously, this is a great perk for recruiting. And it also increases developer productivity and retention. So mentors and mentees are actually 70% more likely to stay compared to other employees. It also reduces those knowledge silos. So if everybody has to explain code, like if a mentor needs to explain code to somebody else, that means all of a sudden that person isn't the only person that knows that specific part of the code base, which is really awesome. So it also creates a much more positive and helpful and collaborative team culture, and it really increases employee engagement. So highly, highly recommend mentorship. It's not just for the mentees, it really is for the mentors as well. And this idea of shifting the role of a senior developer. So mentorship is great, but how do I actually add it to my teams, right? You can do the formal one-on-one sessions where a junior and a senior go into a room. You can also do code reviews. This is a really great way to start facilitating mentorship. Authors learn from the comments of their reviewers. Reviewers learn new patterns and important information about the systems. Pair programming as well is really awesome. So this is where the senior developer does not touch the keyboard and lets the junior developer drive. This is how I learned a lot of my, in my early development career, this is what I did a lot. Also tech talks, just schedule a lunch, get 5 people together, give a 5-minute presentation about something you're excited about, right? And there's a lot of these internal tech talks that happen at large organizations. So it might start off with 5 people at lunch, but then it could become 100 people, right? And maybe it happens every single month. So again, you're kind of encouraging everybody within your organization to share their knowledge and talk about things they're excited about. Also chat channels. If you just create a chat channel, we have one, it's called Dev Party. And so this promotes a place where developers can just share links and talk about problems and solutions and just have conversations about development. So this is really nice because it's kind of like a water cooler. So we talk about a lot of different things today, but it basically is summarized into this idea of the PAMstack, right? A lot of people come up to me and ask me, okay, well, I'm a junior developer. How do I actually make this successful within my organization? Well, one thing to do is just mentor the people that are being onboarded that are below you or, newer within the organization, whether that be a junior or a senior or a mid-level. Also, ask questions about the project, the code, and the processes. And when you are told the answers, just write it down and then give it to somebody and say, like, hey, I was onboarded, and by the way, I wrote everything down about the onboarding, so now the next person who's onboarded, you can just use this piece of paper. It's very useful. Also, ask for code reviews and do code reviews proactively. Don't be scared, right? Like, even for that, senior architect who, maybe nobody ever reviews his code, which would be terrible, or his or her code, but, code review their stuff and see what happens because it helps you understand the code base, and it also kind of forces them into this idea of, if you ask questions, they have to explain themselves, which they might hate, but hopefully they get used to it. And if your team loves these processes and reviews that you're doing, then ask it to be formally incorporated into the process. We really believe in this idea of giving back to the community. We do so much for the community, but especially the first Thursday of every month, we actually have this thing called Angular Online. And if you're excited to speak, and maybe you don't live in a place where you have a local meetup, or you want a place where you can actually gather with other Angular developers, come check it out. It's the first Thursday of every month. It's online. You can sign up online, and we'd love to have you. Also, if you're interested in Angular consulting, we're, of course, always hiring. I was laughing because I was like, oh, we're not hiring for all. I'm so happy. I said that last week. We're hiring again. So let us know, and we'd be super happy to help. And, besides that, again, I just really want to thank, Anna and Sherry and all the other organizers to put on NG Spain, because it's just been awesome to see. I mean, that was one of the the best introductions I've had, and I love the idea of sustainability and making sure to be conscious. So thank you so much for having me.